The best way, I think, to understand the Four Noble Truths, and really the whole Buddhist path, they say, is contained within these basic tenets, I think, is to think of Buddha as a very wise doctor who is giving kind of medical counsel to, us.
To start off by saying how excited I am to join you today, and just want to say hello and welcome to FO Talks and by Fair Observer, an independent nonprofit media organization that informs and educates global citizens of today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Ann Hofmann. I'm a professor of English at Frederick Community College in the Washington, D.C. area, and I teach contemporary American literature and cultural studies. I'm also a liberal Catholic with a deep interest in spirituality and religion and its intersections with everyday public and private life. Ultimately, I come to this talk today deeply honored, humbled, and curious about the new global significance of Buddhism and the many ways human beings across centuries and continents have used philosophy to examine suffering, ecstasy, relationship, consciousness, and the divine. I also arrived today humbly as a fledgling student of Sanskrit and ask your grace as I do my best to honor this beautiful ancient language with a bit of a clumsy American English tongue. So today, our speaker is the eminent Srinivas Reddy, a scholar, translator, and musician. Srinivas is guest professor of South and Southeast Asian Studies at IIT Gandhinagar in Gujarat, India, a visiting assistant professor of religious studies and contemplative studies at Brown University. Srinivas is also an accomplished sitar player, a direct disciple of the late sitar maestro, Pandit Nikol Banjari. In this episode of FO Talks, Srinivas will speak about the new global significance of Buddhism. He will outline how Buddhism drew upon earlier Indian philosophical traditions, spread around the world, and continues to be relevant today. Welcome, Srinivas.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's been a pleasure to meet you, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have after the talk, which I hope we can, maximize, because I love discussion. And also thank you to Atul for inviting me to do this, and Rohit and all the others who have put time and energy into putting this all together. It's a pleasure to have this platform to share some of my thoughts and ideas about Buddhism. So I will try to keep this pretty brief. We'll try to do this in a half an hour, a full kind of history of Buddhism and raising some issues for discussion. So let's get to it. I'll share my screen and we can go through a short presentation. Everyone can see that?
We can see it, yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you again. Today's talk, as Atul suggested, was the new global significance of Buddhism. And I think it's actually important to think, first of all, just Buddhism at its core, and I'll kind of get into this, as it began and as it spread, kind of had a global significance from almost the very beginning of its inception. So it's really interesting to think about Buddhism as a religion that was very much connected to travel and the passage of ideas from different cultures. And what we're seeing now today in the 21st century is something I think unique in a sense, but also an extension of certain themes and ideas that have been inherent within the Buddhist tradition from the very beginning. So on that note, of course, this is a picture of Avalokiteshvara, the Lord of Compassion, from a Buddhist tanka, very beautiful and symbolic of wisdom and compassion being the two wings of Buddhism, and how we can bring those two elements of our lives together. So this first image that we're looking at is really nice because it shows that Buddhism originated in generally what we call Bihar today in India, so in the northeastern part of India, and spread to all different corners of the Asian world in pretty, amazing, quick, and diverse ways. And I'll kind of just mention some of those places and some of the significant aspects of that transmission. But again, just to stress that, when we look back historically, the ideas of kind of nations that we have today, of course, did not exist. Buddha was born in Lumbini, in the Lumbini Gardens, which you can still visit today, which is in Nepal. And most of his life was spent in that northeastern, north Gangetic Plain area of India. But the message of Buddhism spread very quickly after that, particularly to parts of India, particularly the south. And as we'll see, one of the major places that Buddhism really kind of developed, particularly in terms of the canon, what we call the Tripitaka, or the Buddhist sutras, written down in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka was very important in the early transmission of Buddhism. So just to look through, you have a passage to different parts of the Indian subcontinent. You have passages, through the Silk Road kind of pathways into what we call today Afghanistan, which then was called Gandhara, where it interacted with, a lot of Greek thought. You had the passage to China, Southeast Asia, Korea, and Japan, and further onwards, of course, to the Western world. So we're going to look at all of that quickly, and I'll try to keep this as short as possible to give a very quick survey of Buddhist history and philosophy, which is not so easy to do, but I hope it'll be informative and interesting for everyone. And again, if you have questions, you can add them to the Q&A, and we're happy to discuss them as we move forward. So one of the ways that we can even just see, interestingly, the spread of Buddhism is just by looking at certain basic terms. And this is an important point to think about. I think, again, when you think about Buddhism as a global phenomenon, fundamentally, we have to remember that Buddhism is, at its core, an Indian religion, meaning that it was born within the context of a Indian philosophical milieu. It draws on many pre-existing Indian ideas about life, the nature of reality, the cyclical, way of rebirths, et cetera, et cetera. So just from a linguistic perspective, for example, I'll kind of take these backwards. I mean, Zen Buddhism, as people have heard about, Zen, it's also quite popularly, known in the Western world, actually comes from the word Chan, which is Chinese. And that comes from the Prakrit word jhana, and that comes from the Sanskrit word dhyana. And all of these are important to remember because they're all completely linked together etymologically, but also stress the importance of dhyana, which is meditation, as part of the core of at least what the Buddhist monks practiced in the original days. And I'll kind of discuss this issue about Buddhism and its connection to meditation vis-a-vis monastic traditions versus lay practitioners, and how that's important to remember. So this is just a small example of that passage. And what is really important, again, is that as Buddhism moved to all these different places, it was extremely important for people in these newer areas to be able to link themselves back to that core Indian base. And that's because, like much of the knowledge system methodology of Indian thought and Indian knowledge, you have to learn this from a teacher. You have to have a personal one-on-one connection to someone. So tracking a lineage of experience, and that is, the experience of, whether it be enlightenment fully or the experience of your teacher's knowledge, whatever that is, you need a human connection to make that happen. And that's why it was so critical for these new cultures that were, taking in Buddhism, to have some way to link it through a very clear person by person lineage all the way back to the historical Buddha. So the idea is, the wisdom, the enlightenment, the experience of, meditation or all of this is like a candle that needs to be, lit up And in order to do that, you need another candle that's already burning. And by touching that candle, you get that light. So it's really important to remember how critical lineage is, and the transmission of knowledge through human beings is to this tradition, but also, I would say, in general, all Indian knowledge system traditions. So this is a beautiful fresco from northwestern China, and there's a whole set of cave paintings that depict this stuff. And I like to show this just to show again that even at an early stage in Buddhist history, it was an incredibly diverse religion in terms of the practitioners. And you can kind of see the different faces of people in this painting. On the left, you have a fair-skinned man with this white beard. And Buddhism really traveled. It was in many ways a religion of merchants, and through that kind of movement of merchants, it really attracted a large, vast and complex and diverse group of adherents. And it's critical to remember that as much as it was Indian in its core, it really became, a very inclusive and diverse religion from very early on. So I think there's many other types of examples like this where you can see Buddhist images, like particularly in Gandhara, as I mentioned earlier. You'll see even the idea of having the Buddha as a figure, because in early Buddhism, Buddha was not, in the iconography, was not depicted as a human being, but rather as maybe a symbol, a tree, just his feet, the wheel of life, that kind of thing. But many people say that under the influence of these other cultures, particularly the Greek tradition in this case, the idea of a figurative Buddha, like actually having statues of Buddha, really developed. So it's quite interesting how all of these cultures also had their imprint on Buddhism, which later, came back to influence what was happening in the subcontinent. And this is another big theme that I want to stress, is the kind of circularity of influence that's happening. So something moving out, changing, transforming into something, and then returning to its source, and then reinvigorating that and formulating that in what we would consider like the root tradition. So again, to stress the point that Buddhism, today we think of it as, let us say, a separate religion from Hinduism or Jainism or any other religions of the world. But it's very, very important to remember that Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, they all fall in a very related category of religions. And generally they call them the dharmic traditions, because they all fundamentally are working with this idea of dharma. So the real point that I want to stress is that Buddhism is coming out of a pre-existent philosophical, metaphysical tradition that developed in India. Particularly, I would say, like the Upanishadic tradition, which is, post-Vedic, more speculative, philosophical, metaphysical in nature, but also combining that with the very, non-systematized forms of yogic practice that were also present in India. And, this is a big discussion to be had, but in many ways, Buddhism was a way, Jainism as well, of formalizing certain yogic practices and bringing them into the fold of what we would call a more, Brahmanically formulated idea of, life and philosophy. So I know that's a big statement, and I can unpack that a little later, but the main issue here is that there are some really fundamental things that all three of these traditions share. They all deal with karma, action, what do we do in life, dharma, whether it's about the duty of life, the teaching of life, or even the reality of life, idea of a self or a soul, or negating it, as the Buddhists do, but they all deal with this idea of Atma, and they all deal with the idea of nirvana, which is fundamentally, a release from this cyclical existence of life. So samsara, the idea that, we are reborn over and over again, ananta anadi, endlessly, beginningless time to endless time. that all of these principles in their various kinds of interpretations are all fundamental to these traditions. What makes Buddhism and Jainism, however, different than what we would call, standardized Hinduism per se, is that Buddhism and Jainism at a kind of a basic level reject the validity of the Vedas. The Vedas are the kind of revealed sacred scriptures of Hinduism, and the Buddhists and Jains both deny those as valid, perfected knowledge, the way that all the Hindu traditions kind of accept. And this is what relates to what I was saying earlier about yogic practices, because the fundamental base of both Jainism and Buddhism is that realization, full realization, self-realization, full knowledge, what they would call kevala jnana in Jainism, all come from within the individual. And it's something that you derive through these, practices of meditation and yoga and other types of practices. But fundamentally, that sense of self and knowing comes from the inner practice. It's not something outside. Okay, so Buddhism starts with Buddha. And of course, his name was not Buddha at the time. He was known as Gautama, he was known as Siddhartha. And the name Buddha, in fact, means one who was woken up. And is woken up in the sense of has woken up to the reality of what life really is. And again, this is the Mahabodhi temple. You can still visit it today. This is where the Buddha is supposed to have attained his enlightenment or his awakening underneath the Bodhi tree, which also is still there. It's not the exact same tree. It's actually taken from a graft of the tree that was in Sri Lanka. So in a way, it's the same tree, but it's not the exact same tree. And just to stress again how important the yogic tradition or the very disparate types of yogic practices that were going on in India were to Buddhism. When the Buddha first left home to kind of seek his enlightenment, he studied with different yogic masters of various traditions, and he learned a lot, but eventually kind of went on his own and developed his own path, which is known as the middle way, which we'll kind of discuss a little bit later on too. And then soon after that, he left Bodh Gaya and he went to Benares. He went to Sarnath, right outside of Benares, and that's where he gave his first sermon, his first discourse to 5 disciples who were his yogic practice mates earlier on that he had left. And he begins with his teachings, and that's really what began the whole Buddhist Sangha, that is the Buddhist monastic community that spread widely and quickly very soon after that. So yes, here's a picture of Sarnath. You can still, again, it's beautiful that so many of these things that we talk about from ancient times are so living in India today. You can really go to all of these places, and they're not just kind of archaeological ruins, they're living places. I mean, the Bodh Gaya is filled with all sorts of activities. And again, what's interesting, if you go to Bodh Gaya, there's a temple from every country that practices Buddhism in Bodh Gaya. It's really like this international center, because again, each culture wants to link itself back to that root in the Indian soil. So the Buddha's first teaching, which is called the Dharma Chakra Pravartana, which means the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, so the first turning of the teachings, he lays out really the core fundamental tenets of Buddhism, particularly the Four Noble Truths, the idea of the middle way, that you can't be fully into kind of sensual pleasures, nor can you be completely away from society and engaging in a fully ascetic life, that there's a kind of a middle way to things. And then later on, we have the development of other Buddhist ideas like pratitya samutpada, that's codependent origination, and of course impermanence, anitya, that nothing is permanent, things are always dynamic and changing. So these are some of the fundamental principles that Buddha had developed even in his own lifetime and teachings. So here's my quick summary of the Four Noble Truths. The main thing to remember is Well, people always say it always sounds so negative because the first noble truth is suffering, which sounds bad, but it's not like that at all. It's actually quite a positive thing. The best way, I think, to understand the Four Noble Truths, and really the whole Buddhist path, they say, is contained within these basic tenets, I think, is to think of Buddha as a very wise doctor who is giving kind of medical counsel to, us people who are suffering from different things, the troubles of life, and we're confusing. What is the meaning of life? What should I do? How should I act? So the fundamental first noble truth is saying there's an issue at hand that needs addressing. And that is that human suffering, whether it's a personal suffering, or it's a physical suffering, a mental suffering, a spiritual suffering, something is, a dis-ease, something is not right. So that's the first thing, is that there's a problem here to address. So that's what the first noble truth is saying. And this issue goes on and on and on and on again, because it's samsara and we have this cyclical thing. And it's that suffering actually that's really keeping that wheel turning. So the next noble truth is this suffering has some kind of an origin. To understand that there is a root cause to this problem. And really, this is the fundamental thing to remember, that for the Buddhists, the origin, the bottom line problem, the root cause of our problems is tanha, which is, well, that's Pali, but in Sanskrit, trishna, which really means thirsting. So a craving, like it's our desire, it's our wanting for something that is creating our problem. The third noble truth says there is a way to deal with this, because we do have a method, we do have the option, let us say, to remove this thirsting. We can stop this thirsting. There is some kind of way to remove this. And then the fourth noble truth is the path by which we do that, and that of course includes many things. It's called the Ashtanga Marga, the Eightfold Path, which includes having a right view, right living, right kind of meditation, right kind of behaviors, etc., etc. So basically, the Four Noble Truths are setting up Buddha's analysis of the human condition and how we can kind of remove the suffering that we are all experiencing. And one of the main things that the Buddha came up with was this middle way. This is a beautiful, amazing statue. I think it's in the Lahore Museum, which again, you can still see today. And the Buddha's main realization when he came, was sitting underneath the Bodhi tree, was going too far into extreme asceticism is not good. Going too far into enjoying all the pleasures is not good. So Buddha proposed the middle way, that is, Madhyamaka. And really, it's fascinating because he wants us to kind of tread that place between the social life that we experience as human beings, the connections we have to people, but also to, embrace that inner life and place of inner knowledge and tranquility that we can all have. So it's neither one nor the other. It's really a balance between the two, which is a very important part of the, particularly the Buddhist path. Okay, as I had mentioned before, Sri Lanka was a critically important place very early on in Buddhism. This is where the whole Buddhist canon, the literature of Buddha, was written down, what we call Buddha Vachana, the words of the Buddha in the Tripitaka. And so Sri Lanka, from very early on, was a real stronghold for the development of Buddhism. And one of the connections that India had to that transmission was also Ashoka, the great king, who, as the story goes, fought this very terrible battle in Kalinga, a lot of bloodshed and warfare. And then he decided to convert to Buddhism, and he sponsored a lot of Buddhist monasteries. And although he, some people say he wasn't necessarily a Buddhist per se, but it's clear that he appreciated Buddhist ideas and spread them, but also kept a very tolerant view. It's not like he wanted everyone to become Buddhist. He was just kind of trying to spread these ideas of Buddhism. One, and I won't even read out this whole passage, but one of them is a move towards vegetarianism. What's interesting in this, again, it's again a kind of a middle way. He says, in the kitchen of the beloved of the gods, that is Ashoka, King Piyadasa, again, that's Ashoka, hundreds of thousands of animals were killed every day to make curry. But now, with the writing of this edict, only 3 creatures, 2 peacocks and a deer are killed, and the deer not always. And in time, not even these creatures will be killed. So it's quite amazing to look at these inscriptions and read what the king was kind of spreading and percolating throughout the land. Okay, another important aspect of the Buddhist tradition is really the scholasticism that Buddhism inspired. And this is again a place you can visit today, Nalanda, very important Buddhist university with thousands of monks from all around the world. So we have a lot of examples, like for example, this quote that I won't read out all this stuff. And if you'd like to have the presentation, I'm happy to share it with everyone. Huizang came and did this huge big pilgrimage throughout the Buddhist world and wanted to see all of these places that, where the Buddha lived and where Buddhism was being practiced. And, he basically says that there were people from all over coming to this place to study. So it was like an international university right in the heart of India. And again, the idea that people wanted to come to India because it was the source is really important. And even today, like, for the last, I'd say 10 years, every time I've heard the Dalai Lama speaking, he always talks about Nalanda Buddhism. And of course, Nalanda Buddhism is special, the development of, Mahayana Buddhism, particularly, and we won't get into the details of this. But again, this important connection to India as the source of where this stuff is coming from. So this is Bodhidharma, the great transmitter of Buddhism to China. He's called the first patriarch. And again, he also traces his line back, and some people say maybe even he was an Indian yogi himself. So always this connection, even so moving out, but reconnecting to the source. Here's Shantideva, a beautiful scholar, Tibetan, Indian, but in the Tibetan tradition, and was a scholar at Nalanda. He's very revered in the Tibetan tradition. He wrote a text called the Bodhicharyavatara, which is a beautiful expression of the Mahayana path, the Bodhisattva ideal, the idea that, enlightenment is not just for the individual, but enlightenment should be for all. And that the true path of the Buddha is not to seek one's own, end to suffering, but to spread that to every sentient being in the world. Here's the beautiful Kamakura Buddha in Japan. Buddhism came later to Japan through both Korea and China, but again, has been integrated so deeply. And as I was mentioning, Zen, of course, was really important. And Zen in particular, I'll get to that in 1 second. Here's a beautiful picture of Borobudur. This is in Indonesia. It's considered the largest Buddhist temple. I just wanted to show these images just against a sense of how diverse the spread of Buddhism was. So just to return to Zen, Zen was really one of the first forms of Buddhism that came to the Western world. Particularly, there's a book, what's it called? I forget the name exactly right now, The Flying of the Swans or something like that. It's a great study of how Buddhism spread to, the Western world. And Zen was a very important one. A lot of Zen masters from Japan, particularly, both in the Soto and Rinzai traditions, came to the West. This is the San Francisco Zen Center. It was one of the first really important places where Buddhism came to America. And, it was one form of Buddhism. There's, of course, again, many forms of Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism, for example, is very popular these days. All right, so now I'll try to quickly go through the rest of these. So as Buddhism kind of spread throughout the Asian world, it did kind of die out in India in terms of practitioners. And, today we say in India, there really aren't any Buddhists, at least not from that kind of old tradition. But we do have a whole new set of Buddhists because Babasaheb Ambedkar converted to Buddhism right at the end of his life and converted many of his followers, many untouchables and Dalits, to Buddhism. And so many of the Buddhists that we see today in India are from these communities, and it's having its own, development. If you go to, for example, if you go to Bodh Gaya today, there's so much information about Ambedkar and a lot of books and information that you can get about that. So it's an important kind of thing to think about how, again, things move, they come back, they die out, they're revived, they come back in new ways. And this is all happening vis-a-vis the Buddhist teachings. So that's one thing to remember. Buddhism and activism, very important, again, for how Buddhism is moved. This is MLK with Thich Nhat Hanh, who just passed away recently, who is, of course, a great practitioner, and also very important in terms of bringing what was happening in Vietnam to the fore from a Buddhist perspective. And this idea of Buddhism and activism is also something that I think is it's very popular right now, and I think we need to think about that. I'm sorry if I'm going through a lot of this stuff quickly, but we can have a good discussion on whatever points are interesting. But I just wanted to give like this overview of things. Here's the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, who's, of course, a world figure. And the thing that the Dalai Lama has discussed for many years now is this idea of secular ethics. And I think this is an interesting thing to think about, because, particularly in a Western context, sometimes, the division of state and religion being a kind of fundamental tenet, like where I am right now, Providence in Rhode Island, that's where that whole kind of doctrine started with Roger Williams. But if we think about it, even using the word secular in a way invokes a sense of religiosity. And we can't deny the fact that a lot of the ethics that we're getting are derived from, these traditions and these religious, practices. So it's a funny thing to think about the idea of secular ethics. Maybe it should just be ethics or human ethics. And like the Dalai Lama always says, kindness is my religion. So maybe it's just really about that shared humanity, which is what I think he's getting at. But this idea of secularity is something I think that's really important to think about, especially in a Western context, and particularly in America, with the, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual idea. It's a very tricky kind of dichotomy to entangle, but it's important to think about. And now we come to, what's happening right now. I mean, 20 years ago, no one talked about mindfulness really, but now you see it everywhere. Everyone has a mindfulness practice or wants a mindfulness practice. Mindfulness comes from the Sanskrit word smriti, which means to remember. In Pali, it's sati. And often my guru would say, it's like when you you're having a conversation and suddenly you get really angry for no reason, and you forget yourself. You kind of lose yourself and you do something that's not like you. And sati or smriti or mindfulness is really about remembering who you really are. And that who you really are, of course, in a deeper Buddhist sense is, you are not the self, actually. You are not this I, you are not this thing, that there's something much more profound going on, that in that negation of self is actually an affirmation of the interconnectedness of all humanity. So that's a really important thing to consider also. But anyway, the point I wanted to make here is that Buddhism is a fashion right now, and it's something to think about. At one level, we're saying we want to have secular ethics. At another level, people are joyously saying, I'm a Buddhist now. So there's something here, I think, that I feel a little bit of, friction, not in a bad way, but it's just, again, something to think about, which I would love to discuss more. So here's more kind of, Buddhism in the news, Buddhism in the kind of modern media, popular attention. Here's a few quotes from Jack Kornfield. I'll read them out. I like them a lot. He was a very important teacher of Buddhism, particularly in the New England area, and particularly within the Vipassana kind of tradition that's very popular these days, Goenka's tradition. So, but the reason I mention these quotes is, again, there's a kind of attempt or a desire to take the religion out and keep the philosophy in. And again, I think there's something that's happening there that we need to interrogate. So the entire teaching of Buddhism can be summed up in this way: nothing is worth holding on to. So that kind of mantra, nothing is worth holding on to, becomes easy. Everything that has a beginning has an ending. Make your peace with that and all will be well. Wisdom says we are nothing. Love says we are everything. Between these two, our life flows. These are beautiful quotes and lovely things. The Buddha did not say these things, but they developed out of, particularly, Kornfield and other people's interpretation, experience, and practice of Buddhism. So now I wanted to get to really the heart of what I'm trying to say, is that the new Buddhism that we see today in the world, a lot of the reason why people like it is because I hear this all the time. Well, Buddhism's not a religion. It doesn't have a God. Well, you can have a religion without having a God, first of all. And the other thing is, there's plenty of gods in Buddhism. And there's plenty of religious-like things happening in Buddhism, like worship, pujas, all sorts of things, ritual, etc., etc. So Buddhism is very much a religion, I will say that. Yes, it's also a science, but there's a lot of science in other religions too. I mean, that kind of rational thinking, analysis, philosophical underpinnings, all of that. So is Buddhism a science or a religion? I mean, I think Buddhism is both. And I think that's a point that I'd like to discuss more about. The second point, which I've kind of been mentioning, is this idea of deracinization. So to deracinate, sorry for the fancy words, but just to deracinate means to uproot something. So, in many ways, Buddhism has been uprooted from its kind of core and stripped of that religious underpinning and foundation, and repackaged as just, a type of scientific truth, a universal truth. And to me, this is a type of neo-Orientalism, just taking it's co-optive in a certain way. And I think, again, that's something to think about. What's funny about that is, number 3 is that once it's been co-opted, it's re-co-opted by the original culture. Like Atul earlier was mentioning Yoga Day. I mean, 20 years ago, no one in India was practicing yoga. There were no yoga studios around. The only people that did yoga in India were yogis. But once yoga became what it is today, because of its development in the West, it has now returned to India in this new kind of avatara, and people are practicing yoga, and there are yoga studios, and all of that. So again, the real point I want to make, which I've tried to stress, I hope, is this idea of the cultural circulation of stuff as it moves forward, and how things leave, transform, and come back in new forms. And this cycle just goes on, just like samsara itself. The fourth point I mentioned earlier, universalism versus secular ethics. Is there something universal about Buddhism that's not universal about other religions? I'm not sure. Is kindness the core of all religions? Maybe. Are there ethics that we can all agree upon as human beings? Yes, maybe. All of these are questions we need to ask ourselves. Are some of those principles and universal ideas rooted in religions? Yes, I think they definitely are. But do we need to, again, deracinate those religious underpinnings to make them available to people? That's a question to think about. If we do, is there a harm? Is there a certain kind of violence that's happening when that is done? You know, to return to the mindfulness thing, the entire mode of how mindfulness, particularly as developed by John Kabat-Zinn, was, well, I see this beneficial practice, and I certainly learned it through the Buddhist tradition, but I can't teach Buddhism to my patients, so I'll call it mindfulness-based stress reduction, and then it's fine. And so it's a way that Buddhism got into the Western scientific medical paradigm by a kind of subversion. Now, I'm not saying that's really good or bad, but I think we do really need to accept that as part of how Buddhism is making this vast and expansive spread throughout the world. And the last point, just to sum up, is the idea of social activism and whether or not, you know, Buddhist practices in particular, or just contemplative traditions in general, are important to it. But when we look at all of these factors, we see that these two come together. And I think a good, you know, just to wrap it all up and tie it together, is the middle way is really, I think what Buddha would say is that, you know, you need contemplation. That is, you need that sense of, you know, who am I? What is my inner kind of sense of self and my own kind of development as an individual, balanced with my engagement with the outside world. So I hope that that was not too much information really fast. I know I spoke quickly and threw out a lot of ideas, and I already went over time, but thank you everyone for listening, and I hope that was fun. Please feel free to send me an email. I could share this presentation with you all, and I hope you didn't get sick listening to all this. So thank you.
Did not get sick at all listening to all this. What a beautiful, beautiful presentation. I thank you for everything that you shared. My brain is lit up in a million ways with so many questions that really have been crystallized by the last slide that you shared with the themes for discussion. And everything that you shared gets me thinking about one word, which is legitimacy, right? Like, what is real Buddhism? And what is co-opted? What is appropriation? And then, does it matter? And to what degree does it matter?
Exactly.
And so as a cradle Catholic, you know, there are a lot of histories of the Catholic Church of violence and things that we can point to that absolutely we can say are negative things. With Buddhism, and the history that you shared, you know, there's this bigger question for me around, you know, does the legitimacy of how Buddhism is practiced or honored matter? So I'm wondering if maybe we could start there. What do you think?
That's a great question. So one is, there's plenty of negative things that happen in Buddhist history too. We can't whitewash Buddhism as like a perfectly wonderful religion. There was, I mean, plenty of violence happened with Buddhist monks, and Buddhism in war is something that's people have done a lot of research on. I mean, even going back to the early days in Sri Lanka. So Buddhism is not some kind of perfect religion. I mean, that's what I really want to stress. I mean, it's just like any other religion. There's nothing. The reason why Buddhism is hot right now is because of the context in which it is being absorbed by places like America, you know, in where, you know, there's a lot of people who don't like the idea of religion because it was formalized or, you know, restrictive or whatever it was. But people want some kind of spiritual, you know, nourishment. And so you leave the tradition that you were in and seek it elsewhere. And you can denigrate where you came, you know, where you started, and kind of glorify the outside thing. So I feel like that is a big part of what's happening with Buddhism. But on the cultural appropriation part, I think for me, it really comes down to, it's like an academic integrity. I mean, you're writing a paper or you're presenting some ideas, and you cite your authors and you say, I got this idea from here, I got this idea from there. And I think it's important to say, if you're using words like, karma or translating into action or whatever, using concepts and ideas that are clearly derived from a tradition, you should be open about saying that, and you should be clear about saying that. And I think it's to me, it's a matter of integrity. And I don't think removing those things so that they're more popular and more accessible to people is necessarily a good thing to do. And then, so the last point, just to kind of tie it back to what you were first saying, is even the Dalai Lama says there's no reason to convert in life in terms of religions, that you can go within your own tradition and find the same teachings that you find in Buddhism. I mean, kindness, love thy neighbor, we all have it, do unto others as you would have done unto you. This is common to all religions. There's no religion that doesn't make that statement. So there's no need for all of this. But at the same time, there is a need, because people are suffering from the historical background of their own personal growth within a tradition that maybe they had issues with, and they want to go outside of it to find the same kinds of things, but in a different kind of way. So, and if that does happen, and that those ideas do spread, I think it's really important to acknowledge where they came from and what they are.
Agreed. And I think that the Neo-Orientalism piece that you mentioned is the danger in the co-opting of Buddhism into, and I'm going to use the term secular, which you depict. You said, look, if we're talking about things being secular, that also is indicating a kind of religiosity or spirituality, right?
So, of course it is, yes.
Right, but if in my mind, the way that, especially if we think about Hollywood, Oprah, the taking on of basically Eastern practices, really without any acknowledgement of the history of the tradition, is, in my mind, a kind of violence and a kind of exoticizing that is not just can be, but is damaging. And so I'm wondering, though, we're having this academic kind of conversation on an international platform. How does that kind of accountability happen? Is it something that, you think needs to be called out more publicly? Or is it really just about having people come to the table and learn it in sessions like these?
Yeah, so you nailed it exactly. So I think we do need to kind of call it out a little bit, but not in a really negative way. It more in a way like, okay, you like stepped into this room, you've taken that first step into this place, and you're seeing it, you're understanding, you're appreciating it. Now take the next step and really get into the deep history, the deep meanings, the real cultural context where this comes from. I think it's really important, and I think we need more spaces like this for people to have discussions about these things and for people to learn more about them. But I also think it's important for people in positions of power to make these kinds of things known as much as possible, and to address that to that larger kind of public who might not have that perspective at hand.
Absolutely. I have many more questions. I have one more for you, and then we're going to move to some that are in the chat. But your slides were so rich with material evidence of Buddhism, right? Artwork.
Yeah.
I know that you're an accomplished musician. The art and the production, not just the production of art, but the material existence of history of Buddhism is important. And I'm curious what you make about the role of the arts and architecture in the history of Buddhism, and just where we are right now in such a production-driven culture. To what degree do you think that Buddhist art matters in the continual, I'm going to use the word expansion, it's not exactly right, but passing on of the tradition, and the maintenance of those kinds of structures? One person in the chat even acknowledged the ruining of Buddhist structures in Afghanistan. And so this seems to be, this part of cultural memory seems to be very important.
Oh yeah, the Bamiyan Buddhas. I mean, when the Taliban destroyed it, it was really sad. I mean, I was mentioning my teacher. My teacher, I remember, just told me he spent one moonlight day, sitting under those statues. And that morning when he woke up is when Russia invaded. So they had to leave right away. And of course, that was really sad. But these are amazing, just historical heritage monuments that we should be preserved. They're beautiful and wonderful. But in terms of art, well, there's all sorts of Buddhist art that happened. And like I was saying, even the idea of a figurative Buddha was not something present in early Buddhism. It came later and made its way back into India. But from a Buddhist perspective, like a real like practicing Buddhist perspective, the art is like kind of a physical manifestation of those teachings, and also a vehicle by which one can practice. Like some of those, like the Dunhuang caves, for example, like there's images of the Buddha. And so, scholars have found that probably monks would go there and do this visualization practice with the art as part of their practice. And, like even the tanka that I showed, a tanka is not just a piece of art. It's a tool for religious realization is really what it is. And this again gets back to our previous question about now people just want to put a picture or a statue of the Buddha in the garden, and it's nice. And I mean, I'm not going to say that's bad. I mean, but why not take another step and learn a little bit about, maybe what country that statue's from, or what was the design of it, or what was the Buddha really doing, and all of those things. Just having that extra bit of interest and knowledge about the source of these things, I think would be really nice. Because it's beautiful too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I do want to turn to the chat and some questions that folks have for you. There have been a number of comments that I won't read out, but just wanted to acknowledge that one person was making the point that India did not exist, in some of the timeframes that we were discussing, and just acknowledging the need for sort of terminology for referring to this area of the world.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that. Buddha was born in what is today Nepal. I was talking about Northwest. I mean, I say India, we could say the subcontinent. Yes, India, that word did not exist, but India, the place, the geographical place certainly did. And, this is a huge question, like particularly in South Asian studies that we go on discussing. Should it be called South Asian studies? Should it be called Indian studies? Should we have Pakistan studies? These discussions can go all over the place. And yeah, it's important to think about, and it's important to, but at some level when you're talking and giving it, there is something Indian going on there though. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. So yes.
Another comment or question here is, how can Buddhism in a practical way, help all of us to at least reduce this never-ending madness on a global level? Global significance of such ideas like Buddhists is needed more than ever these days. So I wondered if you had a comment on that.
Well, again, I mean, I'm not sure if Buddhism is the answer. I think kindness maybe is the answer. I think getting off the internet is the answer. But maybe, again, at this historical moment in the world, and again, not the whole world, in a particular part of the world, like a lot of the world that we're connecting to right now, Buddhism does seem to be that answer. Now, that doesn't mean that I can't get those same ideas if I go deep into my Islamic background or my Christian background or my Judaic background or any of that. All the same teachings are there. But why is it that Buddhism has taken on this? Because in a way, Buddhism has evolved to take on that role as that religion, which maybe doesn't have that more sordid history of violence and oppression. But again, I'm telling you that if you looked into Buddhism, you'll find plenty of those things too. Maybe not at the scale, it's true, that you do in other places, but at the end of the day, I think anyone, if Buddhism is what attracting you and is making you better person or a more peaceful person, then wonderful. That's great. And then my only thing would be take that extra step and really, I mean, if you're going to get into it, do your homework and really get into it. And the other thing I would suggest is, why not take a look back at maybe the religious tradition you might have been raised in or might have grown up with, and find those beautiful parallels that are right there, that are available to you.
This is a somewhat technical question, but it's one that I think many people may have, especially given the popular conversation about Buddhism. It's, what is the difference, if any, between normal Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism?
Normal Buddhism? I mean,
that's the language in the question.
Yeah, so Buddhism is a big term, and there's all different kinds of Buddhism. There's many kinds of Chinese Buddhism. There's many kinds of Tibetan Buddhism. It's all different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. What I was saying before, though, about the Nalanda and the Shantideva and that stuff is, in the Buddhist history of Tibet, I mean, there was as the story goes, the king at one point was, there were Chinese Buddhists there were Indian Buddhists there, and there was one day they kind of had to decide, which route are we going to go, which tradition are we really going to follow, and there was a debate between the two, and I guess the Indian monk won out. And so Tibetan Buddhism has a deep connection to India, more than I think other traditions do, and always did from that period onward. But Tibetan Buddhism, again, we have to get into what the different things. You have the Theravada, the older school, which is mostly in Sri Lanka. You have the Mahayana school, which really develops in India, and then becomes really the center hold of even what the Tibetan tradition is based on. But then the Tibetan tradition also develops what they call Vajrayana Buddhism, which is, a little bit more advanced and esoteric form of Buddhism. And really, if you think about it, that advanced Vajra Buddhism is also linked to, again, a deeper Indian yogic tradition. So the connection between Tibetan Buddhism and Indian Buddhism is very strong. But again, Tibetan Buddhism is no different than any other Buddhism, in the sense that all Buddhisms are different. So they all have their particular idiosyncratic kind of things. And to stress again, Tibetan Buddhism is not a monolithic thing. There's so many different kinds of Tibetan Buddhism, so many different schools and traditions. So
I think the question and the sort of monolithic way that folks talk about Buddhism is, to your original point in your presentation, a reflection of the secular inclusion of a lot of the ideas without really understanding all the specific histories of Buddhism.
Right.
And so it's interesting. There's a question here, though, about, is co-opting necessarily a bad thing? What's the right way to reapply knowledge, right?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm trying to say, that I don't want, in academia right now, cultural appropriation is a big thing to talk about, and it has a very negative valence attached to it. And I would like to, bring that more to center and say, well, cultural appropriation is also just how culture functions. I mean, we've all appropriated so much stuff over, millennia. It's how culture moves and how culture evolves. So it's not so much culture's moving, but things like appropriation and co-opting do have an important thing to say, in the sense that, again, if you're not giving the credit where the credit is due, if you're not acknowledging what's happening, if you're doing this kind of blindly, that's one thing. If you're doing it kind of invasively, that's even worse. So it's like, where is that kind of where is that cultural transmission coming from? Like, if you looked at, like I'm saying, like when Buddhism was spreading to let's say Tibet, I mean, there's such an honor and respect paid to the tradition and the Buddha and to India and where it came from. So this was really important to these people. In the same way, I think we can also respect it in that same way. On a separate point that I think has been circulating a little bit, that I also want to stress, and there's a lot of debates about this. I mean, if you look at like practicing Buddhists in the world, like in Asia, let's say, most Buddhists in Asia, they don't sit around meditating all day. Meditation, there's many Buddhists that don't meditate at all. they go to a temple, they do rituals, they pretty much worship Buddha like many people worship a god, right? So the idea that Buddhism is this like non-religion where people just meditate and have a philosophy is something that really the West has highlighted and put into a certain kind of position, you know what I mean, of importance and prominence that, to be honest, is not there in most of the practiced Buddhism of the world, of people that were kind of born into the Buddhist tradition. So that's another thing that's important to think about.
If I can just clarify your point, are you saying that specifically in Western iterations or explanations of Buddhism presented as a philosophy rather than as a religion?
Yes.
And I can tell you, I believe I took a religious studies class where that was specifically taught. This is a philosophy, it's not a religion. And I really appreciate that clarity from you.
Buddhism is a religion, period. I mean, what is in Buddhism that's not a religion to me? I don't understand. At the same time, Christianity is a philosophy. What in Christianity do I not see as a philosophy? So, I mean, again, I think it's the particular historical context that we're in that has created this kind of perception of what Christianity is, or what Islam is, or what Buddhism is. But if you look at them, you know, historically over time, these traditions, they're all just as much religions and philosophies in relation to each other, you know?
I think religion has, again, I'm getting back to this term legitimacy. Religion sounds like something organized, right? Like, so I'm just wondering if some of that claiming of Buddhism in the West is philosophy is a kind of devaluing potentially of it. I don't know. That's just a thought.
I think people don't want to accept. I mean, there's so much politics and so much hierarchy and oppression and organization and systematization in Buddhism and Hinduism and in all of these religions. I mean, it's really because the gaze has been from here looking that way. So when you're looking out at it, then you just want to see what you want to see, you know, and it's nice. And in a way, it's fine and good too. But again, once that gaze happens, take that next step to make it like a deep inquiry. That would be my only real suggestion for any of this.
I love that. Well, there are a number more comments in the chat that we'll be able to save and share, as well as requests to share your presentation with the audience.
Yeah, and I would love to see all these chats and questions.
Do you?
And I'm happy to keep talking or answering these questions.
Okay, we can stay on a little longer, and I can take a few
minutes.
more.
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
5 more minutes. Okay, so another question. Let me go to. There's actually 2 places where these are coming in the Q&A. So one question is, the conventional view is that Buddhism was a revolt against Brahmanism and the caste system. What exactly was Buddha's position of the caste system? Did he talk about rebirth over and over? He did talk about rebirth over and over again, but was it in the same way as the caste system prescribes?
Good question. But I mean, I wouldn't say it was a revolt against Hinduism or caste system, but certainly the Buddha was critical of caste in the sense that the Buddha believed that any human being could follow this practice and reach enlightenment, that everyone should have access to it. That's really important to remember. So two of the things that you can think about is, number one, Buddhism was always preached in Prakrit, which is again a natural common language, not in Sanskrit. It was only later that Buddhism picked up Sanskrit. So and then as Buddhism was spread, it was always preached in the local languages that it was spread in. So that's really important. The other thing that Buddhism was critical to that I was mentioning earlier is its connection to merchant communities. So really, you know, if you want to talk about varnas and caste, I mean, yes, it's the Brahman Kshatriya relationship that really defined that earlier period of, you know, Vedic culture. So you had the Brahmins who were, the ritual specialists. You had the kings or the kshatriyas who were, sponsoring these things and legitimating their power through those rituals. But then the next class, the merchant communities, were not really part of that. But as this kind of commerce developed, people became more wealthy, trade increased. It's really the merchant class that, took up Buddhism in the early period. And that was really important.
Interesting.
Yeah. And that's also what helped it spread so much too.
That was a great question. Yeah, so I think we have time for one more question, I think.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I do think of Buddhism at times as being antithetical to, capitalist practices in my limited, study of Buddhism, specifically because of the reticence to hold on to things, right? Like to collect. And so to hear that Buddhism spread largely amongst the mercantile class, it's just
it is interesting. Yeah.
So last question. Okay, this is a big one.
All right.
If Buddha is not a god, is there a God? Why don't we hear much about God in reading about and around Buddhism? And this is secondary to a question that was also asked about, is there part of the secular popularity of Buddhism because it doesn't answer the question about God?
Absolutely. So the reason why Buddhism is so popular right now in that secular context is because there is no God. Mm-hmm. But having or not having a God is not what defines a religion to me. It's more of the other things. To me, whether you believe in God or a concept of God or not is not the fundamental principle of defining a religion. On this issue, Buddha did not, by the way, negate the idea of God. Buddha simply remained silent on the issue. So that's the Buddhist take. That's the Buddhist take. Now, because what the Buddha is saying by that kind of a response is, it doesn't matter. That's not even the problem. That's not the issue that we need to even be thinking about. These are, avaktya. They're not able to be discussed because, you could believe any of those things, but it doesn't change the basic fact that you are suffering. So let us get to the real question at hand and look at that. Dealing, the famous story is the hunter's out in the woods and an arrow comes and shoots him. He gets hit by an arrow, and you don't sit there and think, how long is the arrow? Where did the arrow come from? Who shot the arrow? All of those questions, you can ask them, but the most pressing issue is removing that arrow from killing me. And so Buddha is really focused on, this is the issue at hand. This is the issue at hand. So Buddha was silent on that issue of God or no God. So he didn't negate God. But I do think that removing the God part is precisely, in fact, what makes people say that Buddhism is a philosophy. But like I said, if you again go to, even if you pick up any Buddhist text and read it, anything, oh, blessed one, the most beloved Buddha, we worship you and fall at your feet. All of this is there. So there is a certain kind of God-like worship of Buddha happening. But as my teacher, you always used to tell me, it's not that we're really worshiping or want to worship Buddha, but the Buddhist teachings. What does the Buddha embody in terms of those teachings? So really, what you're really paying homage to is the teachings of Buddhism. And if you really believe in the teachings of Buddhism, then you're not worried about God or no God. You're just worrying about removing the pain of your own life and trying to alleviate the pain of others.
Wow, I think that is a wonderful last statement to end on. If you have any closing comments, I invite you to make those. I just have really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that it's been not just informative, but also encouraging to folks who have listened.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And thank you, Anne, for being a great moderator. It's wonderful to engage with you. And thank you for everyone for joining. And I'm just gonna put my email in the chat. And please, anyone who wants to discuss, you can feel free to email me, and I would love to hear from you. I'm sorry I didn't get to have all the questions, and I know there was a lot of other things that people wanted to write, but please feel free to be in touch. Thank you to Atul, Rohit, and everyone, and have a beautiful day.
Thank you so much, Srinivas, for this fascinating conversation. I also would like to thank our audience who is joining us over Zoom, and would like to encourage each of you to continue to subscribe to FO Talks on YouTube. We look forward to more conversations in the future and hope you have a lovely day. Thank you.